Montgomery, Alabama, April 1969. The air inside the Montgomery Coliseum was thick with tension that had nothing to do with the screaming fans or the heat from the stage lights. This was the Deep South, just 1 year after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And Elvis Presley was about to walk on stage with 4 black women as his backup singers, the Sweet Inspirations. Some people in that crowd of 35,000 had come to see the king of rock and roll. Others had come to make a statement. Halfway through Suspicious Minds, it happened. A voice from the darkness hurled a racial slur so vile that the entire band stopped playing. The music died. The crowd fell silent. And in that moment, Elvis Presley had to choose between his career in the South and doing what was right. What happened next would make headlines across America and change the lives of those 4 women forever. If you want to discover how one moment of moral courage changed not just a concert, but the entire trajectory of how race was discussed in American entertainment, please subscribe to our channel. This story has been told in pieces, but never in full until now. To understand what happened that night in Montgomery, you have to understand the America of 1969. The Civil Rights Movement had achieved legislative victories with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But laws on paper didn't change hearts or minds. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1968, exactly 1 year before this concert, had left the nation raw and divided. Cities had burned in the aftermath. The National Guard had been deployed to multiple states, and the backlash against integration was still fierce, particularly in the Deep South. Montgomery, Alabama, wasn't just any southern city. It was the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement, where Rosa Parks had refused to give up her bus seat in 1955, where Dr. King had led the bus boycott that launched him to national prominence. By 1969, the city was a complicated symbol, proud of its place in American history, but also home to residents who deeply resented the changes forced upon them. When Elvis Presley's tour announced a Montgomery stop with prominent black performers featured in his show, it became a flashpoint for tensions that had been simmering for years. Elvis himself had always occupied a strange position in the racial politics of American music. He had built his career on what was essentially black music, rhythm and blues, gospel, the sounds he had absorbed growing up poor in Tupelo, Mississippi, listening to black radio stations and attending black churches. His early success had been controversial, precisely because he was a white man performing in a style that white America associated with black culture. Some saw him as a bridge between worlds. Others saw him as a thief. And now, in 1969, he was making a statement by featuring the Sweet Inspirations prominently in his show, giving them solo moments, treating them as stars rather than as anonymous background voices. The Sweet Inspirations weren't just any backup singers. Houston, the group's founder and leader, was already a legend in gospel and soul music circles. Her daughter, Whitney, would later become one of the greatest voices in music history. But in 1969 was the star. Alongside her were M.N.A. Smith, Sylvia Shemwell, and Estelle Brown, 4 incredibly talented women who had sung with everyone from Arthur Franklin to Wilson Pickett. They were professionals, veterans of the music industry who had paid their dues in clubs and recording studios where black artists were often treated as second-class citizens. even as their music was driving American culture forward. When Elvis hired the Sweet Inspirations for his 1969 return to live performing, it was a significant statement whether he consciously intended it as one or not. He wasn't just giving them jobs, he was giving them visibility, featuring them prominently on stage in elaborate matching gowns, giving them microphones for harmonies that the entire arena could hear, and treating them with a respect that was far from universal in the entertainment industry of that era. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, had actually advised against featuring them so prominently, warning that it could hurt ticket sales in certain markets. Elvis had ignored that advice. The women themselves had mixed feelings about touring through the South. They had grown up there, knew its beauty and its ugliness, and understood that their presence on stage with Elvis would be seen as provocative by some audience members. Before the tour started, they had discussions about how to handle potential incidents, whether to ignore hecklers, whether to respond, what to do if things got truly danger. The evening had started with an undercurrent of tension that the performers could feel even before the show began. As fans filed into the Montgomery Coliseum, there were pockets of visible discomfort. Older white patrons, who had perhaps bought tickets without realizing that black women would be featured so prominently. Younger attendees, who seemed excited by the integrated performance and an overall atmosphere that felt charged with something beyond typical concert energy. Security had been increased for the Montgomery stop, not because of any specific threat, but because everyone involved in the production understood that this was a potentially volatile situation. Backstage, Elvis had been unusually quiet during the pre-show routine. Band members later recalled that he seemed more serious than usual, less prone to his typical joking around and nervous energy. Whether he sensed trouble ahead or was simply processing the significance of performing in Montgomery with an integrated band, he kept his thoughts largely to himself. The Sweet Inspirations, for their part, went through their usual vocal warm-ups and costume checks, trying to treat this show like any other, even though they knew it wasn't. The first half of the concert went smoothly, perhaps deceptively so. Elvis opened with high-energy numbers that got the crowd on their feet. The band was tight and professional, and the Sweet Inspirations provided the powerful vocal support that had made them such a valuable addition to Elvis's sound. If there was tension in the audience, it wasn't yet visible or audible from the stage. Elvis seemed to relax as the show progressed, settling into the groove of performance, feeding off the crowd's energy. By the time they reached Suspicious Minds, one of his biggest recent hits, everything seemed to be going perfectly. Suspicious Minds was always a highlight of Elvis's shows during this period. A song about paranoia and distrust in a relationship that he performed with intense emotional commitment. The Sweet Inspirations had a crucial role in the arrangement, their voices weaving around Elvis's lead, creating a sonic texture that made the song feel urgent and alive. They were about halfway through, building toward the song's dramatic bridge, when everything changed in an instant. A voice from somewhere in the middle section of the Coliseum, amplified by the momentary instrumental break, cut through the music with a racial slur directed at the women on stage. The words were clear enough that everyone in the venue, in the immediate aftermath of the slur, time seemed to slow down in that arena. Elvis had been mid-phrase when he heard it, and his voice simply stopped. The microphone dropped to his side. The Sweet Inspirations had frozen in their positions, their faces showing a mixture of shock, hurt, and something that looked like resigned familiarity. This wasn't the first time they had faced racism, but it was perhaps the most public. The band members were looking at each other and at Elvis, uncertain whether to keep playing or stop. And 35,000 people were suddenly silent. The collective gasp and murmur creating a sound like wind through leaves before everything went quiet. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed for decades. Elvis didn't consult with his band, didn't look to his manager in the wings, didn't pause to calculate the professional consequences of what he was about to do. He walked to the front of the stage, his face showing an anger that people who knew him recognized as rare and serious. The spotlight operators, uncertain what was happening, kept the lights trained on him as he raised the microphone to his lips and spoke in a voice that was controlled but shaking with fury. "Stop right there," Elvis said. And though he wasn't shouting, the words carried to every corner of the arena. "We're not going to continue until something is made clear here." The silence was absolute now. 35,000 people holding their breath. I heard what was just said. A lot of you heard it too. And I want everyone in this arena to understand something right now. He turned and gestured toward the sweet inspirations who were standing motionless at their microphones, tears visible on M&A Smith's face. "These ladies are not just my backup singers. They are not just here to make me sound good, though Lord knows they do that. These women are artists. They are my colleagues. They are my friends. And more than that, they are my family." The way Elvis emphasized the word family carried weight beyond its literal meaning. In the South of 1969, claiming black people as family was a radical statement, a rejection of the entire social order that segregation had been designed to maintain. Elvis continued, his voice growing stronger and more passionate with each sentence. "I come from Mississippi. I grew up poor." Elvis paused, letting the moment breathe, and when he spoke again, his next words would be quoted in newspapers across the country the next day. "These ladies are not just part of my show. They are the show. And more importantly, they are human beings who deserve respect." Now, I can see the exit doors from here. They're not hard to find. If you can't give these women the respect they deserve, if you can't listen to them sing without hate in your heart, then I invite you to leave right now. Because we're not going to continue until everyone here understands that this stage, this show, this music, it belongs to all of us, not just to people who look like me. The silence that followed Elvis's words was deafening. For what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody knew what was going to happen next. This was the moment of maximum danger. Elvis had drawn a line, had made it clear that he was willing to sacrifice the show and potentially his career in the South over this principle. He was staring into the crowd, not with aggression, but with an intensity that dared anyone to challenge what he had just said. Then someone started clapping. Then more people joined. Within seconds, the majority of the 35,000-person audience was on their feet applauding, some cheering, some crying. The sweet inspirations, who had been frozen in shock during Elvis's speech, were now embracing each other, tears streaming down their faces. But this wasn't a unanimous response. There were sections of the arena where people remained seated, where arms stayed crossed, where faces showed anger at what they had just heard, and there was movement toward the exits as some attendees, perhaps a few hundred people, decided to leave rather than accept what Elvis had demanded of them. Security later reported that the exit of those few hundred was tense, with some shouting insults as they left, with others arguing with family members who wanted to stay. There was at least one physical altercation in the concourse as someone tried to prevent their companion from leaving. But the vast majority of the audience remained, and as the last of the dissenting crowd members filtered out, something remarkable happened. Someone in the crowd, and nobody ever identified who started it, began singing the opening lines of "We Shall Overcome," the anthem of the civil rights movement. Elvis stood on that stage, visibly moved, tears running down his face as he listened to the crowd sing. The Sweet Inspirations joined in, their professional voices lifting above the crowd's earnest but imperfect harmonies. And then Elvis himself began to sing, his voice blending with theirs, and with the thousands in the arena, creating a moment that nobody present would ever forget. It wasn't a planned part of the show. It wasn't something they had rehearsed. It was simply what happened when people chose unity over division, when they chose to stand together rather than allow hate to win. When the spontaneous singing of "We Shall Overcome" finally ended, Elvis wiped his eyes, took a deep breath, and made a decision that would change the rest of the show. Instead of returning to suspicious minds where they had left off, instead of trying to recapture the energy they had before the interruption, he turned to the Sweet Inspirations and asked them what they wanted to sing. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't how Elvis's shows were structured. But this wasn't a normal show anymore. Houston stepped forward to her microphone, conferred briefly with the other three women, and then said something to Elvis that the audience couldn't hear. Elvis nodded, walked to the band leader, and gave instructions. What happened next was unprecedented in Elvis's performing career. He stepped back from center stage and gave the Sweet Inspirations the spotlight for a full song, not as background to his lead, but as the featured performers. They sang "People Get Ready," the Curtis Mayfield gospel soul classic, about liberation and hope. And they sang it with everything they had, pouring out emotions that had been building for years of performing in the shadow of racism, years of being treated as less than they were. Elvis stood behind them during that performance, not singing, just standing there as a visible sign of support, occasionally adding a harmony line, but mostly letting them have the moment. The crowd listened in a hushed, reverent silence that was completely different from the energetic applause of a typical concert. This felt more like church than entertainment, more like witnessing something sacred than watching a show. When the Sweet Inspirations finished, the standing ovation lasted for several minutes, and M.N.A. Smith later said it was the most powerful moment of her entire career. The rest of the concert had a different quality than a typical Elvis show. The energy was more subdued, but somehow more meaningful. Elvis introduced each member of the Sweet Inspirations by name and gave brief tributes to what they had contributed to music, turning what would normally be quick acknowledgments into genuine moments of recognition. He told stories between songs about growing up in Mississippi, about the black musicians who had influenced him, about his mother, Gladys, working alongside black women, and the friendships she had formed. He was using his platform not just to entertain, but to educate, to help his audience understand that the music they loved was inseparable from the black culture that had created it. The immediate aftermath of the Montgomery concert was complex and multi-layered. News of what had happened spread quickly, first through word of mouth as attendees called friends and family, then through local newspaper coverage, and eventually through national media outlets. The headline in the next day's Montgomery Advertiser read, "Elvis takes stand on race at concert," and the article described the incident and Elvis's response in detail. Within days, the story had been picked up by newspapers across the country, with reactions falling along predictable lines based on the political leanings of the publications and their readers. For Elvis personally, there were immediate professional consequences. Several southern venues that had been tentatively scheduled for future tours quietly informed his management that they were no longer interested in hosting him. Radio stations in certain markets reduced their Elvis rotations or stopped playing his music altogether. Colonel Parker was reportedly furious, not because he disagreed with what Elvis had done morally, but because he saw the financial implications. Letters poured into Elvis's fan club offices, with about 60% expressing support for his stance and 40% expressing anger, disappointment, or outright hatred. Some of the negative letters were so vicious, so filled with racial slurs and threats, that they had to be turned over to law enforcement. But there were positive consequences too, perhaps more significant in the long run. The Sweet Inspirations, who had been well known in certain circles, but not mainstream stars, suddenly found their profile elevated significantly. They were invited for interviews on television shows, profiled in magazines, and offered recording opportunities that might not have come their way otherwise. Within the music industry, Elvis's stand had ripple effects. Other white artists who featured black performers began to speak more openly about racial issues, perhaps emboldened by Elvis's example. The incident became a case study in how to handle racism when it erupts in public spaces, not by ignoring it or trying to smooth it over, but by confronting it directly and making clear what values you stand for. Entertainment venues began implementing clearer policies about acceptable behavior, and some artists began including explicit anti-discrimination clauses in their performance contracts. For Elvis himself, the Montgomery concert seemed to crystallize something that had been forming in his mind for years. He had always been uncomfortable with the way he was credited as the creator of rock and roll, when he knew he was building on foundations laid by black artists like Arthur Cradup, Big Mama Thornton, and countless others. He had been quietly generous with money, helping black musicians who were struggling, but he hadn't been particularly public about his views on race. Montgomery changed that. In interviews following the concert, Elvis began speaking more openly about his debt to black music and black culture. He used his platform to recommend black artists to journalists who were interviewing him, to talk about the systemic inequities in the music industry, to push back against the narrative that he had invented rock and roll. This wasn't comfortable for him. Elvis was generally shy about serious topics and preferred to keep things light, but he seemed to feel an obligation to speak up that he hadn't felt as strongly before. His relationship with the Sweet Inspirations deepened after Montgomery. They weren't just his employees anymore. They became genuine friends, people he trusted and confided in. When Houston's daughter, Whitney, began showing vocal talent as a child, Elvis encouraged to nurture that gift, told her that Whitney could be even greater than her mother. The women noticed that Elvis began asking their opinions on things beyond music, seeking their perspectives on social issues, trying to understand experiences different from his own. It was as if confronting racism so publicly had opened something in him, made him more conscious of his own privilege and position. But there was also a weight that came with the Montgomery stand. Elvis received death threats following the concert, serious enough that his security detail had to be increased significantly. There were concerns about assassination attempts, particularly when he performed in certain southern cities. He tried not to show fear publicly, but people close to him noticed that he became more paranoid, more isolated, more dependent on the protective bubble that his fame had already created around him. Some biographers have suggested that the increased security and isolation following Montgomery contributed to Elvis's later struggles with prescription drugs and his retreat from public life. To fully appreciate what Elvis did that night in Montgomery, it's important to understand what he risked and what was at stake. In 1969, taking a public stand against racism wasn't just morally right. It was professionally dangerous for a Southern white entertainer whose fan base was largely conservative and Southern. Elvis wasn't naive about this. He knew that his position as the king of rock and roll was dependent on maintaining good relationships with the very people he was challenging. He knew that Colonel Parker's ability to book shows in certain markets would be compromised. He knew that some fans would never forgive him, but he did it anyway, and that matters. History is full of people who did the right thing when it was convenient or safe to do so. Elvis did the right thing when it cost him something, when it wasn't strategically smart, when it went against the advice of his management and potentially threatened his career. That's a different kind of courage, and it's worth recognizing even as we acknowledge that Elvis benefited enormously from white privilege throughout his career, and that one moment doesn't erase the complex racial politics of his rise to fame. The Montgomery concert also has to be understood in the context of what was happening in America in 1969. This was the same year as Woodstock, the same year as the Stonewall riots, a time when young people were challenging every aspect of the established order. But Elvis wasn't a young radical. He was 34 years old, a product of conservative Southern upbringing, someone who had served in the military and generally respected authority. For someone like that to take such a public stand meant something different than if a younger, more obviously counterculture figure had done the same thing. It suggested that the moral consensus on civil rights was shifting even among 50-plus years after the Montgomery concert. The story continues to resonate. The sweet inspirations, or at least those members still living, still talk about that night in interviews and memoirs. They describe it as a defining moment, not just in their careers, but in their lives. A time when they felt truly seen and valued in a way that had been rare in their experience. They credit Elvis with using his power and privilege to protect them, to elevate them, to insist that they be treated with dignity, even when it cost him professionally. For younger generations learning about this story, it often comes as a surprise. The popular narrative of Elvis Presley tends to focus on his music, his style, his movies, his tragic end, but not necessarily on his moral courage or his stance on civil rights. Yet, this moment is part of his legacy, as important in its own way as any of his hit records or iconic performances. It's a reminder that artists have platforms that extend beyond entertainment, that they have the power to influence culture in ways that transcend their art, and that how they use that power matters. The Montgomery concert also serves as an interesting case study in how moral stands age over time. In 1969, what Elvis did was controversial, dividing his audience and costing him professionally. Today, everyone agrees that he did the right thing, and the people who left that concert in protest look like the villains of history. This pattern repeats throughout history. Actions that are risky and divisive in the moment become obviously correct in retrospect once the moral arc has bent far enough. The question for each generation is whether we have the courage to do what will look obviously right 50 years from now, even when it's controversial and costly in the present. The Montgomery incident inevitably raises broader questions about Elvis's relationship with black music and black culture. These are complicated questions without simple answers. Elvis built his career on a musical style that was fundamentally created by black artists, and he achieved a level of commercial success and mainstream acceptance that many of those original black artists never received. That's an uncomfortable truth that can't be ignored or explained away. Elvis benefited from white privilege in an industry that was systematically biased against black performers, and he became wealthy and famous performing music that black artists had created but could. But it's also true that Elvis never claimed to have invented rock and roll, that he was consistently generous in crediting his influences, that he genuinely loved and respected the music and the culture it came from. He hired black musicians, featured black performers, and as Montgomery demonstrated, was willing to risk his career to defend them. The question of whether this absolves him of the charge of cultural appropriation is one that people will continue to debate, and there's probably no answer that will satisfy everyone. What we can say is that the situation is more complicated than either Elvis was a racist thief or Elvis was a civil rights